Behind a sealed palace door, with the late afternoon light fading across the red boxes on his desk, King Charles made a decision that was never meant to feel like a public spectacle and yet carried the force of one. It was not a speech. It was not a ceremony. It was a final palace instruction, written in the careful language of duty and continuity, but received inside the family as something far more personal. And when Camilla learned what he had done, the shock was not simply that a line had been drawn. It was that the line had been drawn by the man whose hand she had held through scandal, illness, and the unbearable weight of the crown. The country would eventually see a constitutional adjustment. Inside the palace, it felt like a private heartbreak wrapped in royal velvet. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this story is not only about titles and procedure. It is about loyalty, timing, fear, and the painful moment when a reigning monarch decides that love can no longer be allowed to blur the future of the institution he serves. What happened, in simple terms, was this. King Charles authorized a final restructuring of how Camilla's future position, visibility, and authority would be handled, in the event that his reign entered its most fragile phase, and in the inevitable transition beyond it. The wording was formal, palace wording often is, but the meaning was unmistakable. Her role would be protected with dignity, yet contained with precision. Her public standing would remain respected, yet her operational influence would not continue into the next era, in the way many around her had quietly assumed. This was not an insult. It was something colder, and in some ways, more devastating. It was a settlement. That mattered, because Camilla had not entered the royal story as a symbolic ornament. Over the years, through ridicule, resistance, and the long shadow of public memory, she had become a stabilizing presence in Charles's private life, and, gradually, in his public one. She understood his moods, his habits, his resentments, his private uncertainties. She knew which briefing would irritate him, which delay would exhaust him, which family silence would cut him more deeply than any front page. In that sense, she was never merely beside the monarch. She had become part of the machinery that kept him standing. Yet this time felt different. This was not about a tour. It was not about a patronage. It was not about which household office controlled a schedule or which aide had lost favor. This was about the future shape of the monarchy when Charles himself could no longer dominate the center of it. And in royal life, that question changes everything. Succession is not only who inherits the crown. Succession is the careful design of who fades, who remains, who advises, who appears, and who must step back so that continuity does not become confusion. The first sign that something was wrong came not in public, but in the quiet stiffness of the evening routine. Camilla had been expecting one version of the future, one built on assumption rather than promise. The assumption was simple enough. She would continue to be honored, consulted, and placed with care. She would retain symbolic stature, and perhaps, in the softer private arrangement of a widowed or diminished court, she would still carry a kind of maternal authority around the household. She was not expecting dominance, but she was expecting permanence. Instead, a senior private secretary arrived with documents that had already been reviewed, already initialed, already fixed in process. No dramatic flourish, no audience of ministers, just paper, protocol, and the terrible royal skill of making irreversible things sound reasonable. Camilla read the pages once, then again, more slowly. Her expression, according to those close enough to see her that evening, did not break into anger. It hardened into stillness. The instruction did not erase her. That would have caused outrage. It did something more subtle. It defined her future as honorary, rather than directional. It preserved her dignity, but removed the possibility of lingering influence over succession planning, household alignment, public symbolism, and key ceremonial decisions once the next reign fully took shape. In plain language, it meant she would be respected, but not allowed to cast a shadow over William and Catherine's future court. She would be secure, but no longer central. That distinction may sound small to outsiders. Inside a monarchy, it is immense. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Camilla had spent years learning how royal life really worked. She knew that what was never said aloud often mattered more than what was read from a lectern. She understood ceremonial precedence, which meant the order in which royal figures are presented to the public, not as vanity, but as a coded message about authority. She understood household structure, which was the web of offices, advisors, planners, and private loyalties that turn a family into an institution. And so she understood immediately what Charles had done. He had not discarded her, he had placed a limit around her. When she asked who else had seen the document, she was told, gently, that the necessary offices had been consulted. Constitutional advisors had reviewed its implications. Senior household figures had discussed implementation. William's office had not drafted it, but William had been made aware of the direction of travel. Catherine, too, understood its significance. That detail landed heavily, because if there was one thing Camilla could endure, it was public criticism. What she struggled to endure was the feeling of being quietly managed by a future already gathering around her. But to understand why Charles made that final palace decision, it is necessary to go back, because the story did not begin on the day Camilla read those pages. The decision was not born that morning. It had been forming for months, perhaps longer, in private briefings, strained glances, and one particular palace incident that forced everyone involved to confront a truth they had spent years postponing. It happened during a major internal planning session tied to a ceremonial season that was supposed to project order and strength. The event itself, from the outside, appeared routine enough. Cars arrived, uniforms gleamed, courtiers moved with their usual calm efficiency. Yet beneath the polished surface, the pressure was building. Several households were coordinating around the king's long-term visibility, the Prince and Princess of Wales's rising burden, and the sensitive question of how the monarchy should present itself in a period when personal health, generational change, and public trust were all moving at once. A planning table had been set with seating charts, route papers, speech notes, and what palace officials call continuity drafts. A continuity draft is not an obituary and not a surrender. It is a practical document for what must happen if a sovereign becomes unable to perform fully or if public demands force a rapid shift in representation. The monarchy survives on preparation. That is its strength. It is also its cruelty. At some point in the discussion, attention shifted from the event itself to the symbolism of who would appear where, who would receive which greeting, who would stand on which side of the king, and how press photographs would be interpreted. To ordinary people, such things can sound absurd. Inside a royal system, they are nothing of the sort. One balcony position can suggest continuity. One altered order of appearance can signal authority. One repeated visual pattern can begin preparing the nation for a future nobody is yet ready to name. Camilla, by all accounts, argued her position with discipline, not theatrics. She believed that continuity for Charles also meant continuity for her. If he was to be seen as active, stable, and still sovereign in more than name, then his queen should not appear marginal. That was her view. There was logic in it. Yet others in the room, especially those focused on long-term stability, saw a danger. The more visible and operationally central Camilla remained in these sensitive layouts, the harder it would be to clarify the next chapter without emotional and constitutional confusion. William's representatives were careful, but firm. The future court, they indicated, needed clearer air around it. Catherine's rise had to be protected from ambiguity. That did not mean disrespecting Camilla. It meant ensuring that the monarchy did not drift into a blurred arrangement in which yesterday's emotional battles were carried forward into tomorrow's ceremonial structure. The room chilled. No one raised their voice, but the silence deepened. Charles, who had entered the discussion expecting logistical order, found himself facing a deeper argument than he had wanted to endure. He had expected concern. He had not expected the scale of institutional resistance to an open-ended role for Camilla in the post-Charles landscape. It was in that room, some later said, that he first understood that what felt to him like loyalty to his wife looked to the monarchy like deferred risk. The meeting ended without explosion, but not without consequence. Papers were gathered, chairs were pushed back. Courtiers adopted the neutral faces they wear when they know that history has just moved an inch. Charles lingered. Camilla left with the controlled composure that often appears when someone is too proud to show the wound at once. William was briefed in fuller terms that evening. Catherine, always more restrained in such matters, asked only one question. Was the palace preparing the future or postponing it? That question haunted the days that followed, because what happened next was not a single confrontation, but a sequence of smaller ones, each more painful than the last. Charles found himself trapped between two truths. The first was deeply personal. Camilla had stood with him when much of the world judged him harshly, when his public image was damaged, when his private life was treated as a national morality play. The second was institutional. The crown could not be arranged around personal gratitude. The monarchy could survive criticism, scandal, even temporary unpopularity. But it could not survive vagueness at the point where one reign gives way to the next. A monarchy is, at heart, a structure of continuity. Continuity meant there could be no confusion about where public loyalty should settle when the future became the present. That was the advice coming from every serious corner of the palace system. The Lord Chamberlain's office looked at ceremonial implications. Constitutional advisors looked at titles and boundaries. Private secretaries examined housing, staffing, correspondence, and how patronages would be managed. They were not debating whether Camilla should be treated kindly. They were deciding how kindness could be made compatible with clarity. At first, Charles resisted, not loudly, not theatrically, but in the weary, stubborn way that had marked much of his life. He questioned timing. He questioned tone. He questioned whether his advisors were allowing old public emotions to interfere with humane planning. He worried, perhaps most of all, that Camilla would experience the move not as prudent architecture, but as personal rejection. He was right to worry. The private confrontation came several nights later. It was one of those palace evenings in which everything appears calm to the outside world, while, inside, the atmosphere feels weighted with history. Dinner had ended. Footsteps had faded. The corridors carried that peculiar royal hush that makes even ordinary words sound like part of a record. Charles and Camilla were alone. No transcript exists, of course. None ever would. But those familiar with the aftermath have described its emotional shape with striking consistency. Camilla did not begin with outrage. She began with disbelief. She asked whether he had truly allowed officials to design a future in which she would be present but peripheral. She asked whether William's court had already become the hidden architect of her reduction. Most painfully, she asked whether Charles had signed away not her title, but her place. Charles tried to explain what, in his mind, he was doing. This was not punishment, he said. It was prevention. It was a way to spare the next reign from inherited tension. It was a way to ensure that when William's era arrived, no one could say the old conflicts had been left alive inside the walls. It was, in his language, an act of stewardship. But the truth was more painful. To Camilla, stewardship felt like surrender. She had not asked to become the center of the next reign. She had asked, or at least believed she had earned, the right not to be quietly diminished in preparation for it. She had endured too much, she felt, to be tidied away like a difficult chapter in a family archive. He told her that dignity was guaranteed. She heard that power was not. He told her she would be honored. She heard that she would be managed. He told her the monarchy needed certainty. She heard that certainty no longer included her. It was not a shouting match. That would have been simpler. It was worse than that. It was two people who had spent decades surviving the judgment of others, discovering that they could not protect each other from the logic of the crown. No one raised their voice, but something heavier than anger settled between them. A realization. The realization that even at the top of royal life, where privilege is vast and ceremony endless, there comes a point when the institution reaches into marriage and rewrites what loyalty is allowed to mean. The next day, Charles requested a smaller review. Not a reversal. By then it was too late for that. But he wanted the language examined. He wanted to know whether greater tenderness could be built into the arrangement. Could the titles be phrased differently? Could the residence plan be softened? Could the ceremonial role remain more visible without compromising succession clarity? His advisors were sympathetic but immovable. They explained that partial vagueness would only postpone a sharper reckoning. If Camilla's future status was left too open, every future engagement, every public appearance, every anniversary, every illness bulletin, every balcony image would generate speculation. And speculation, in royal matters, is not harmless gossip. It becomes pressure. It becomes faction. It becomes the slow erosion of confidence. This was not, they insisted, about a woman. It was about a system. Yet systems do not cry in private. People do. That was the moral loneliness at the center of Charles's position. He could still remember the long road that had led Camilla from outsider to accepted consort. He knew the cost in patience, humiliation, and strategic silence. He knew what it had taken for public hostility to cool, for ceremonial roles to settle, for the phrase queen consort to become something people no longer flinched from hearing. To now tell her, even politely, that her era would end with his own was, in human terms, brutal. But before the public learned anything, another private conversation changed the temperature of the crisis completely. It was between Charles and William. Father and son had lived for years with unspoken debris beneath their formal bond. Affection existed, so did strain. Shared duty can unite a royal family, but it can also sharpen every unresolved wound, because the stakes are never merely emotional, they are constitutional. When William entered the room for that conversation, he was not just a son speaking to a father. He was the future sovereign speaking to the present one about the border between their reigns. Charles, according to those familiar with his thinking, wanted reassurance that the transition could be handled without making Camilla feel cast aside. William's answer was respectful, but unsparing. Respect alone would not solve the problem, he argued. The monarchy needed a visible, clean line. Catherine's future position as queen had to emerge without shadow or layered competition. Their household could not begin under a cloud of unresolved status around a previous consort, whose presence would inevitably keep old national arguments alive. William was not crude. He did not attack Camilla personally. That was never the point. His point was structure. The next reign had to feel unquestionably its own from the first hour, not merely inherited but clarified. The public, he believed, would accept kindness. It would not accept confusion. And if confusion set in, the burden would not fall on anonymous aides. It would fall on the throne. Charles listened. That silence told William more than any reply could have done, because in that silence there was grief. Not only for Camilla, but for the truth that William was speaking from the logic Charles himself had spent a lifetime defending in theory, yet now found devastating in practice. Catherine's role in all this was quieter, though no less important. She was not the architect of the decision, and those who know her approach say she would never have wanted the matter personalized into a contest between women. That was not her style, and not her interest, but Catherine understood optics with uncommon discipline. She understood that a future queen cannot inherit uncertainty without paying for it in authority later. She also understood something more delicate, that the monarchy, already strained by illness, distance, generational fracture, and public fatigue, could not afford a transition that looked emotionally tangled before it even began. So the planning continued. The official household became the stage on which emotion was translated into process. Staff rosters were reviewed. Future private offices were discussed. Patronages were categorized by whether they belonged to a personal legacy or a reign-linked function. Residences were analyzed not merely as homes but as symbols. A royal residence is never just a place to live. It is a sign of relevance, access, and standing. Which rooms remained active, which household staff remained attached, which events required appearance, which did not, all of it carried meaning. State papers were updated. A state paper was not necessarily legislation. In this context, it meant formal documentation that guides how sensitive royal arrangements are to be executed, communicated, and defended if challenged. The papers were technical, but their emotional implications were explosive. They described a future in which Camilla would be honored for service, recognized in dignity, and shielded from humiliation, but firmly removed from the functional center of the monarchy's next phase. There were suggestions of compromise. There always are. Some proposed a more expansive dowager-style role, softened with charitable leadership and occasional ceremonial presence. Others thought even that was too risky, because every appearance would invite commentary over who truly embodied royal womanhood in the new age. In the end, the line Charles signed favored containment over ambiguity. And then came the leak. Palace systems are disciplined, but they are not silent forever. News does not always escape because someone wants revenge. Sometimes it escapes because too many people have felt the tremor. A whisper became a briefing. A briefing became a careful question from one editor to one correspondent. Before long, broadcasters were circling, newspapers were sharpening their language, and that old British instinct for reading constitutional weather returned almost at once. At first, the headlines were cautious. Palace Review, future role under consideration, household transition planning. But the country is rarely fooled by soft language for very long, especially where the royal family is concerned. Commentators began asking whether the king had effectively restricted Camilla's post-reign status. Royal watchers spoke of generational consolidation. Former courtiers used phrases like inevitable clarification and protective planning. The more measured the public language became, the clearer the underlying drama appeared. Crowds gathered outside the usual gates, not because anyone expected a balcony appearance that night, but because royal uncertainty has always drawn people toward the buildings themselves, as if stone walls might somehow answer questions flesh and blood cannot. Camera crews reported with that distinct mix of reverence and appetite that follows every palace crisis. The nation debated what it meant. Was Charles protecting William? Was he conceding to pressure? Was Camilla being humiliated, or merely placed where history had always intended her to stand? The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was still more painful. Because by then, Camilla was no longer wrestling only with the document. She was wrestling with the public interpretation of it. She knew how quickly a royal woman can be turned into a symbol convenient to everyone except herself. Some would call her overreaching. Others would cast her as a victim. Both would flatten the reality. The reality was that she had inhabited one of the hardest roles in modern monarchy, and had done so under scrutiny few people could bear. Now, at the moment she most expected private loyalty, she felt the full chill of institutional necessity. There was an afternoon, shortly after the leak widened, when she reportedly withdrew from one internal discussion earlier than planned. Not in fury, in exhaustion. Those who passed her later said she looked neither defeated nor defiant. She looked like someone who had finally understood that the palace can absorb decades of devotion without ever promising emotional reward in return. Charles, for his part, appeared publicly composed. That is what sovereigns are trained to do. He continued with engagements, accepted papers, met officials, and spoke in the measured tones expected of a monarch who must never seem ruled by personal turbulence. But observers noted a heaviness around him, the kind that does not come from logistics alone. This was not simply a king managing transition. It was a husband living with the cost of a choice he believed necessary and still hated. The deeper constitutional meaning slowly emerged beneath the emotional drama. What Charles had done was not revolutionary in legal terms. It was more intelligent than that. He had used the immense flexibility of palace organization, ceremonial framing, and household authority to achieve what law did not need to shout. This is often how the monarchy protects itself, not with dramatic decrees, but with structures that quietly shape reality before reality can become a crisis. A regency is what happens when a monarch cannot perform duties and another acts in his place. That was not what this decision created. But the very fact that people began discussing such matters showed how sensitive the moment had become. Any hint that the palace was preparing beyond the present instantly awakened questions about health, durability, and readiness. Charles understood that. So did his advisors. That is why the final document was so carefully drawn. It needed to solve one problem without appearing to trigger 10 more. Yet royal life is never only about what is solved. It is about what is felt. And what was felt in the palace after that leak was a mixture of relief, sorrow, discipline, and quiet anger. Some believed Charles had done the only responsible thing. Some believed he had done it too late. Some thought Camilla should have been better prepared emotionally before the machine moved around her. Others argued there is never a good way to tell someone that history will respect them more than the future will empower them. William's camp kept its public silence. That silence mattered because silence in such moments is also a message. It said there would be no triumph, no visible claim, no public sense that the future was pushing the present out of the way. Catherine, likewise, remained above the noise. No statement, no signal, no visible appetite for advantage. The monarchy needed solemnity, not choreography of victory. Still, The symbolism became impossible to ignore. Every appearance was now read through a new lens. Every photograph became a question. If Charles stood with Camilla, was he reassuring her or reassuring the public? If William and Catherine took a larger share of attention, was that natural evolution or accelerated transfer? If Camilla appeared composed, was she accepting the decision or simply refusing the humiliation of visible protest? This was not palace gossip anymore. It was a drama about the meaning of continuity itself. The monarchy could survive many things, but not uncertainty at the point where loyalty must shift from one generation to the next. That was the brutal lesson beneath the headlines. Charles had spent a lifetime preparing to be king. He knew better than most that preparation can feel like disloyalty while it is happening. Yet once ignored, it becomes far more dangerous later. In signing that final palace decision, he had chosen preparation over comfort. He had also chosen, perhaps for the first time in this marriage, the crown over the emotional expectations of the woman closest to him. There is a loneliness in that sort of choice that public debate rarely sees. People imagine kings as powerful because they can sign. But a signature at that level often reveals not freedom, but captivity to duty. Charles could protect Camilla's honor. He could not protect her from history. He could cushion the language. He could not erase the meaning. He could hold her hand. He could not let her future role become an obstacle to the future reign. The final symbolic scene came days later, and it was all the more powerful because almost nothing was said. At a public appearance that had long been on the calendar, Charles and Camilla arrived together. The crowd, sensing more than it knew, watched closely. She stepped out with composure. He turned toward her, just slightly, in a gesture so restrained that another audience might have missed it. But there it was. Not theatrical apology, not performance, recognition. They walked forward side by side, and for a few moments, the public saw what the palace crisis had almost buried. Two people who had endured history's judgment together, now bearing a quieter wound, one that did not come from scandal or press hostility, but from duty itself. A few steps behind, in a different visual rhythm, the future of the monarchy was already present in outline, steady and waiting. That image mattered because it captured the real shape of the event. Camilla had not been banished. Charles had not withdrawn affection. William had not staged a coup. Catherine had not engineered a displacement. The truth was harder, and therefore more human. The family remained bound, but not unhurt. The institution remained stable, but only because someone had accepted the pain of making its boundaries clear. In the days that followed, the palace language settled into the usual formulas of reassurance: service, continuity, dignity, respect. Those words were not false. They were simply incomplete. What they concealed was the emotional arithmetic underneath. To preserve one future, another expectation had to be reduced. To protect the next reign, the present had to discipline its own affections. To avoid later conflict, a painful line had to be drawn now, while everyone still hoped it might never be needed. This was not a palace tantrum. It was a royal reckoning. And perhaps that is why it has struck such a nerve across Britain and beyond. Because beneath the crowns and titles, people recognize something painfully familiar. The moment when love and duty stop walking in step. The moment when gratitude cannot be allowed to decide structure. The moment when a family, however famous, realizes that protecting tomorrow may require wounding today. For Charles, the decision will likely be remembered as one of those cold acts of monarchy that look simple on paper and devastating in the heart. For Camilla, it may remain the moment she understood that acceptance at the top of royal life still carries conditions no devotion can fully erase. For William and Catherine, it strengthens the road ahead, but at a cost that no wise future sovereign would celebrate. And for the monarchy itself, it marks a grim but necessary truth. Preparation is not betrayal, even when it feels like it. Continuity is not cruelty, even when it causes private pain. The crown endures not because it avoids sorrow, but because it knows how to absorb it and keep moving. In the end, that may be the deepest meaning of Charles's final palace decision. He did not end the present. He acknowledged the future. He did not publicly diminish the woman beside him. He placed the monarchy where he believed it had to stand, when his own shadow begins to shorten. The family remained wounded, but united. The institution chose clarity over comfort. And behind those ancient walls, where love has so often been tested by rank, one more painful lesson was written into royal history, that even at the highest level of power, the hardest decisions are not always about who is loved, but about what must outlast love. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.